So remembering that what we're driving here are macro level curves, we're now going to look at the aggregate demand curve. And here's what we want to remember. Just as the aggregate supply curve was called supply, but it was really better understood as an output response to price changes kind of curve, we want to think of the aggregate demand curve in a very different way. So the aggregate demand curve, like the aggregate supply curve, should not be thought simply as when price goes down, you buy more quantity, just because in this case, why would you reshuffle between goods and so on? But you want to think about overall context. Second, the curve we're going to generate is a curve whereby I'm going to say, what is the equilibrium level of expenditure for different price rates? So in other words, every point that I'm going to generate here, this is real GDP, has to have the question, what is happening to the equilibrium level of GDP in the Keynesian cross? To when price changes, does something happen to change one of the autonomous levels of expenditure inside that income expenditure model to cause the equilibrium level of GDP to fall? So that is the thinking behind what I'm calling aggregate demand curve. So I'm essentially asking, what is the equilibrium level of expenditure for different price levels? If a price level change makes no difference to the equilibrium, then there is no response. But if price level changes creates a change in C plus I plus G plus X minus M, then there's a change. As it turns out, price level changes in one country do actually imply there's relative price changes between the goods of country A and country B, and that can affect X minus M. But we're going to hold off on that because we don't get a chance to think of exchange rates in this class. So right now I'm just going to ignore that one. Now, G is usually set by the government, and we'll talk about what's happening. C depends on what the equilibrium level of our GDP is, and it depends on your consumption function. And so one of the key questions is going to be, is there an effect of price changes on I, or on investment? And it turns out that as it happens, price level changes do end up creating a very interesting set of dynamics, not because something is cheaper, but because of wealth, interest rate, and financial market effects, right? It's not in the, it's changes happening there, which then filters back to effect I. So the first thing, let's look at C. When prices, let's say we started at P1, and I've got C plus I plus G plus X minus M, and I looked at my equilibrium. This is my equilibrium from my Keynesian cross, and it's over here. Now what happened if price dropped to P2? There's three things happening. First, when there is a generalized drop in prices, if wages are sticky, on the demand side, there might be an initial reaction before everybody gets laid off, where my wages are still what they were, but things have become a bit cheaper. All right? So that's one. Two, there might also be wealth effects, because if prices drop, what this means is that the purchasing power of my assets has gone up, right? So I have a bank balance, and if prices drop a bit, I'm like, hey, I can buy a lot more with my bank balance. So there is a sort of wealth effect where a decrease in prices has made me have higher purchasing power with my assets. There's also some redistribution effects where a drop in prices means that this is a benefit to debtors, less to creditors, and so on. But those effects we hope will balance out unless they become very big. But overall, on the consumption side, I can see assets and wealth effects and so on creating a little bit of boom in the autonomous component of consumption. Not the MPC necessarily, but this. For the MPC itself to change, I would need income redistribution to go so badly out of whack that my total MPC is starting to shift. But usually in the short run, it's the autonomous component, a little more spending. Second, investment depends on the interest rate, and the interest rate depends on the Fed. So if the Federal Reserve has a particular set of policies it follows to do inflation targeting or to try and manage prices, that's going to have impact on interest rate, which in turn is going to affect investment levels. And indeed, that is one of the things that has been pointed out by a lot of scholars, and the book actually gives you the formula with the Z factor and so on. But less than thinking of the equations, I want you to think of it conceptually. The part of what's happening is when there's inflationary pressure, when prices are high, the Fed tries to contain that. And it does that by essentially shrinking the money supply a little, keeping the interest rates high. When that happens, investment will be less. But if the Fed finds that there isn't any inflationary pressure, there was a time, for example, in Japan when interest rates were almost zero during the worst of the Japanese recession of the 90s, when basically you could not get people to borrow and engage in investment, and this created real problems where the government kept trying to make it easy for people to borrow and invest. So part of what's at stake there is when prices drop, or if the Fed feels that the pressures are coming too far down, the Fed might essentially ease the interest rates, engage in monetary easing. And by doing that, either directly or indirectly, through one of the policies that we described in the last segment when we talked about money markets, it'll try and drop the interest rate. And when that happens, hopefully, firms will respond by increasing planned investment, gross fixed capital formation. And so that in turn will create a higher I, and if there is a higher I, that means that my equilibrium level, using the Keynesian multiplier, will be some multiple of that increase. So because of wealth effects and because of Fed policies, the aggregate demand curve slopes down. That at lower prices, the demand seems to be higher. But again, remember, this is not demand as in demand for apples or oranges. This is what kind of equilibrium level of income in the income expenditure model may I see depending on price level effects, right? So very different kinds of curves, even though on the surface they all look the same. We're now ready to put them together.